There is a quiet calculation that most people never make about Irish history. If you go by the standard account, the one that begins with the Celts, with Druids and High Kings, and the slow arrival of Christianity from the Eastern Mediterranean, Ireland's human story seems to begin around the 5th or 6th century before the Common Era, perhaps a little earlier if you include the arrival of Celtic-speaking peoples during the late Bronze Age. That is roughly 2,500 years of named, documented, mythologized history. 2.5 millennia of story that we can more or less follow, at least in outline, at least in the broad shape of who was where, and what they built, and who they traded with, and what gods they prayed to. But human beings have been living on this island for at least 10,000 years. That means roughly 7,500 years of Ireland's human story, 3 full sweeps of time equivalent to the entire span from the Celts to today, happened in a silence so complete that we have no written record of any of it, no names for the people who lived it, no way to know what language they spoke, what they called the rivers, what stories they told their children in the dark, what they understood about death and the stars and the long Atlantic winter. Those people are not gone. Their work is still standing in fields and on hilltops. Their bones are still in the ground. In a very real sense, their DNA is still present in the bodies of people walking through the streets of Dublin and Galway and Cork and Sligo today, though in proportions and distributions that most people have no idea to carry, and in forms that require a specialist laboratory to read. What happened to them is the story we are going to trace tonight. Ireland has experienced, in its deep prehistoric past, not 1 but 3 episodes of near total population change, events so complete that the genetic evidence left behind looks less like the usual picture of gradual cultural assimilation and more like sequential burial. Each wave of newcomers arrived, built something extraordinary on the foundations of what came before, and was then absorbed, displaced, or replaced by the next group. Each time, a world was covered over. A language vanished without leaving a single written word. An understanding of the landscape, encoded over generations into monuments and seasonal rituals, and a visual symbolic language, was overwritten by a new one. And the monuments remained, the mounds and the tombs and the carved stones remained, because you cannot easily move 100,000 tons of earth. But the people who built them, who understood them, who knew what the symbols meant and why the passages pointed where they pointed and what was supposed to happen when the light came in at dawn on the shortest day of the year, those people were gone. Not always violently, not always suddenly, but gone in the demographic sense that matters most, their genetic contribution to the next generation and the one after that dwindled to a residue. The later arrivals would walk past these structures and see them as the work of gods, or giants, or supernatural beings who had departed to some other world. They would weave these monuments into their own mythology, repurposing the graves and ceremonial spaces of a vanished civilization as the homes of their own divine ancestors. The mounds became the seed. The passage tombs became the underground palaces of the Tuatha Dé Danann. The builders themselves were transformed into something beyond human, perhaps because no living person could explain how merely human hands had made such things, and perhaps because attributing them to gods was the only way of honoring a greatness that could no longer be accounted for. There is something worth sitting with in that image, a civilization so thoroughly erased that its own greatest achievements were mistaken for the work of gods by the people who walked among them, including, eventually, the people who called themselves Irish. Tonight, we are going to try to recover that civilization, not completely. The silences in the record are too deep and too old for anything like completeness, but in outline. We are going to follow the evidence backwards through 3 distinct worlds that existed on this island before anyone called it Ireland, before anyone spoke a language that became Irish, before the stories we think of as Irish mythology had taken the shape we recognize. We will follow the evidence of the soil, the bones, the ancient DNA that laboratories have been extracting from Neolithic teeth and Bronze Age skulls over the past decade. The results have been, in the precise sense of the word, revolutionary, overturning settled assumptions about who these people were, where they came from, and what was done to them by the people who came after. We will follow the shapes cut into stone at Knowth and Newgrange, shapes that have not been deciphered, that may never be fully deciphered, and ask what kind of mind made them and what became of that mind. We will read the mythology very carefully as a kind of compressed memory, looking for the places where stories seem to be remembering something that happened thousands of years before the storytellers were born. And we will notice with appropriate patience that most of this has been sitting in plain sight for decades, not suppressed by any single authority, not hidden in any dramatic sense, but buried in the quite mundane way that inconvenient complexity tends to get buried, by the simple tendency of every culture to assume that its own story is the original one, and that everything which came before it was merely prologue. Begin, if you will, with the simplest physical fact. Ireland is an island. It has been an island, separated from Britain by the North Channel and the Irish Sea, for approximately 14,000 years. Before that, during the last glacial maximum, when global temperatures were much lower and vast quantities of water were locked in continental ice sheets, sea levels were so much lower that what is now the seabed was dry land, and people, along with animals, could move across it. But by the time the first confirmed evidence of human settlement appears in Ireland, the island was already isolated. Getting there required a boat. It required an intention. The first people to arrive on this island came because they chose to come, navigating water they could not see across toward a land they had perhaps only glimpsed from a distant shore on a clear day, or heard described by other people moving along the Atlantic coast. The island they arrived at was not what anyone pictures when they think of Ireland today. It was covered almost entirely by dense post-glacial forest, oak, elm, hazel and alder in the lowlands, pine and birch higher up, with great reed marshes in the river valleys and wetlands spreading across much of the Midlands where the limestone drainage had not yet fully developed. The coastline was different. Sea levels were still adjusting as the glaciers continued to melt, and many of the bays and inlets that shape modern Ireland's profile were still forming. There were no standing stones, no ring forts, no hedgerows marking field boundaries. There was just forest and water and the animals that lived in them and the sky above it all. Into this came the first people, and the ground beneath your feet is their first chapter, the story of what replaced them and what replaced the replacers, and what was buried in each of those transitions. That is a story that Ireland's ground has been keeping for 10,000 years, and that science is only now beginning, slowly and partially, to read. The River Bann moves through County Derry in the north of Ireland with a kind of deliberate slowness, collecting the runoff from the Sperrin Mountains and carrying it northwest toward the sea at Coleraine. It is a long river, unhurried and dark in the deeper stretches, and the land around it has the particular quality of Irish riverland, flat and rich and slightly too wet underfoot, with the smell of peat never far from the air. On a raised bluff above this river, overlooking a natural ford that would have given access to both the water and the fish that moved through it in great seasonal pulses, is the site of Mountsandel Fort. From the outside, it looks like an earthwork of the kind you find everywhere in Ireland, an irregular raised area, something pushed up from the ground by human hands at some uncertain point in the past. Most of the people who pass it probably take it for a Norman motte or a medieval ring fort, or simply one of those earthen features that the Irish landscape produces in such quantity that the eye eventually stops registering them. It is well signposted now, with a footpath and an interpretive panel. But the feature these signs are marking is not visible from the surface. It was excavated in the 1970s by the archaeologist Peter Woodman, carefully documented and recorded, refilled to preserve what remained, and covered again by the returning grass. What Woodman found under the soil was remarkable. At a depth that years of accumulated material had built up over millennia, he uncovered the physical traces of human habitation dating to approximately 8,000 BC. The settlement at Mountsandel is the oldest securely dated evidence of human presence in Ireland. When the radiocarbon dates came back from the laboratory, the number was startling enough to require careful checking. 10,000 years before the present day, 400 generations before anyone built a stone monument in Ireland, before bronze, before iron, before farming, before writing anywhere in the world. The settlement consisted of a cluster of roughly circular huts. The post holes were still there, pressed into the subsoil, the marks where wooden uprights had been sunk into the ground to create a framework over which hides or bark or woven material could be stretched. The floors of the huts had been compacted by use. Around them, in the middens and hearths, where ash accumulates and seeds and bones resist decomposition more stubbornly than wood or skin, were hazelnut shells by the thousand, fish bones, salmon and eel, both large and recurrent, the remains of wild pig and hare and woodland birds, and the characteristic small stone tools called microliths that are the signature technology of Mesolithic people across all of Northwest Europe. These implements, small, precisely struck blades and points made from carefully selected flint, required considerable skill to produce. The flint knapper who made them would have learned the technique over years, probably from a parent or older community member, and the consistency of the finished tools across the Mountsandel site suggests a community that had been making them in the same way for a long time. These were not farmers. They planted nothing, harvested no cultivated crop, kept no domestic animals. They moved through the landscape according to the rhythms of the seasons, following the salmon up the river in spring, gathering hazelnuts in the autumn when the bushes bent with their weight, hunting red deer and wild pig in the oak forests, harvesting wildfowl from the wetlands in winter. They were generalists in the precise ecological sense, people who had learned to exploit every available food resource in a particular landscape with considerable skill and efficiency. The physical evidence from Mountsandel suggests a community that returned to this particular spot repeatedly, perhaps seasonally, across many generations. The same river bend, the same ford, the same hazel groves on the slopes above. This was not aimless wandering. It was a managed circuit, a deep knowledge of a specific territory accumulated across lifetimes and transmitted across generations. Mountsandel is the clearest window we have into Irish Mesolithic life, but it was not the only habitation of its kind. Other sites have been found across the island, though they tend to be less complete and less well preserved. At Ferreter's Cove on the Dingle Peninsula in County Kerry, excavations uncovered evidence of Mesolithic activity alongside the very earliest signs of contact with farming communities. Domesticated cattle bones at a site that otherwise looks purely Mesolithic in character, an anomaly that has generated considerable debate about what kind of contact was taking place at the very edge of the known world. At Lough Bura in County Offaly, a lakeshore site revealed hut floors, hearths, and substantial flint assemblages, indicating sustained occupation over an extended period. At Dalkey Island off the Dublin coast, shell middens accumulated by generations of coastal people show systematic exploitation of marine resources going back thousands of years. At Hermitage in County Limerick, a cremated human burial radiocarbon dated to around 7000 BC represents one of the earliest known intentional human burials in the country, suggesting that even 10,000 years ago, the people of this island had developed practices for marking the transition from life to death in ways that required some effort, some intention, some understanding that the dead deserved to be remembered. The Mesolithic population of Ireland was small. Archaeological estimates for comparable periods elsewhere in Europe suggest that total populations of islands this size probably numbered in the low thousands. Perhaps no more than a few thousand people spread across an island largely covered by dense post-glacial forest, moving in small bands, crossing water on skin boats, speaking a language or languages we cannot reconstruct even in outline. Their social world was probably organized around kinship networks linking multiple bands across a territory, with regular gatherings at productive seasonal locations where exchange of partners and information and goods would have maintained social cohesion across a geographically dispersed population. The hazelnut groves, the salmon runs, the coastal shellfish beds, these were the meeting places of a world that left no permanent architecture and no written record. The tools found at Mountsandel and at the other Irish Mesolithic sites are sufficiently distinctive in their style. The specific proportions of blades, the angle of retouch, the characteristic forms of the microlithic points, to allow archaeologists to identify a recognizable regional tradition. Whether this represents a distinct cultural identity in any sense meaningful to the people themselves is impossible to say. What it does tell us is that the Mesolithic communities of Ireland were developing in a recognizably local direction. 4,000 years of living on an island, separated from the nearest mainland by a significant body of water, had given this population a character of its own. What did these people look like? For a long time, this question could only be approached through analogy and inference. Ancient DNA analysis changed that. The genetic profiles of Mesolithic individuals from sites in Ireland and Britain show close affinities with other Western European hunter-gatherers of the period. The most widely discussed of these, the individual known as Cheddar Man, from a cave in Somerset whose DNA was published and made headline news in 2018, showed dark skin pigmentation, blue or blue-green eyes, and dark hair, a combination that surprises people whose mental image of ancient Britain or Ireland involves fair skin and red hair, but which is consistent with what we know of the ancestral population of Western European hunter-gatherers across the whole Atlantic fringe of Europe. The two Mesolithic genomes sequenced from Irish contexts, published as part of the large 2020 Trinity College Dublin study, were the first sequenced from this period in Ireland. They showed the same general Western European hunter-gatherer profile while also forming a slightly distinct subcluster, suggesting that the relative isolation of the Irish island population had produced some degree of genetic differentiation from their British and continental contemporaries, even within this early period. Ireland was already, genetically, beginning to be its own particular thing. The first people of Ireland were dark-complexioned, probably dark-haired, likely with lighter eyes than you would expect given the later Irish stereotype. The pale skin and auburn hair and freckled complexion that the world associates with Irishness is a much later development. It arrived in the Bronze Age. The people who first stood on the shore of the Bann and decided to stay were something else entirely, something older, something that connects this island not to the steppe grasslands of Central Asia, but to the western Atlantic edge of a world that was itself very slowly changing. They held this island for 4,000 years. 4,000 years of seasonal camps and river crossings and fires lit in the dark under the hazel trees. 4,000 years of watching the same hills and following the same water courses, of naming the places in a language no living person has heard a word of. They knew the salmon seasons on every river in the north, the hazelnut groves on every slope in the west, the shellfish beds along every rocky stretch of coast. That knowledge, accumulated across 160 generations, was not a small thing, it was everything. And then, around 4000 BC, something changed. New people arrived from the south and east, crossing the sea from Britain, where they had already established themselves, from Brittany and beyond. New tools arrived, new animals arrived, new ways of marking the dead arrived. And within a period that was geologically brief and humanly devastating, a few generations, perhaps a century or two at most, in the places where the transition was most rapid, the world those Mesolithic communities had inhabited for 10 millennia was covered over as completely as a fire covered by fresh earth. Almost nothing of their genes survived in what came next. The people themselves are as gone as if they had never existed. And yet the memory of their 4,000 years persists in the landscape, in the same sites that later people chose, because the land itself had qualities that made it valuable across every period of human occupation. The river bends, the high ground with views, the places where salmon ran reliably, those were already known before the farmers came. The knowledge was embedded in the landscape itself, waiting for whoever came next. The process that ended the Mesolithic in Ireland was not, as far as the archaeological evidence tells us, primarily a military event in any conventional sense. The people who arrived around 4000 BC, bringing domestic cattle and sheep and pigs, wheat and barley seed, polished stone axes suited to the work of forest clearance, and a tradition of burying their important dead under large stone monuments, were not, in the obvious dramatic sense, an invading army. They appear to have been farming communities seeking land, moving in a slow demographic expansion along the Atlantic seaboard of Europe, an expansion that had been underway for centuries, tracing its origins ultimately to the farming communities of Anatolia in modern Turkey, where agriculture had first been developed in the ancient Near East around 10,000 years ago. By the time these early farmers reached Ireland, the agricultural way of life had already spread through Greece, Italy, France, and Britain. The genetic profile of these incoming populations is one of the clearest and most consistent signatures in the ancient DNA record. What researchers call early European farmer ancestry, which traces back ultimately to the Neolithic populations of the Eastern Mediterranean. When you look at the ancient DNA of Neolithic individuals from Irish sites, the woman known as Ballinahatti, buried near Belfast around 3200 BC, whose genome was published in 2015 by a team led by Dan Bradley at Trinity College Dublin. The adults and children excavated from the Pulnabrone Dolmen in the Burren of County Clare. The many individuals whose remains were deposited in the Great Passage tombs of the Boyne Valley. You find a population whose ancestry is overwhelmingly of this farming type, Near Eastern in its deep roots, Atlantic European in its more immediate genealogy, closely related genetically to the Neolithic populations of Brittany and Iberia, who had received that Near Eastern ancestry through the same chain of westward movement. The Mesolithic people of Ireland contributed, according to the best current genetic modelling, roughly 20% of the ancestry of the Neolithic population that followed them. 80% came from the farmers themselves. This is not a gentle blend. This is not two populations meeting as equals and gradually merging over centuries. This is a demographic shift in which the people who had held this island for 4,000 years were reduced to a small genetic residue in the next population, still present, but present in the way a whisper is present in a loud room, or the way a faint color persists when a brighter one is mixed heavily over it. How did this happen? The honest academic answer is that we do not know for certain, and the mechanisms of Mesolithic to Neolithic transitions in different parts of Europe are actively and sometimes heatedly debated. What the evidence does allow us to say is this: the incoming farmers had substantial demographic advantages. They brought domestic animals, cattle and sheep and pigs, which represented a stored and portable food surplus that hunter-gatherer economies simply could not match over the long run. A community of farmers with a herd of cattle can support a significantly larger population per square kilometre of land than a community of hunter-gatherers in the same landscape. Over time, even without any direct conflict, that demographic advantage compounds into a numerical superiority that fundamentally alters the reproductive arithmetic of the two populations. There may also have been a disease component, and this deserves careful note as informed speculation rather than established fact. When populations that have been geographically isolated come into contact with populations from more densely settled agricultural regions, the isolated group tends to be at an immunological disadvantage. The farming communities of Europe had been living in closer contact with domestic animals and with each other for generations, and the pathogens that circulate in such densely connected conditions differ from those in more dispersed hunter-gatherer populations. The possibility that the Irish Mesolithic population was significantly affected by illnesses brought by the incoming farmers, illnesses to which the farmers had partial resistance through prior exposure, is consistent with what we know of similar contact situations in other times and places, though direct evidence specific to Mesolithic Ireland is not currently available. At Ferreter's Cove in Kerry, the site that shows domesticated cattle bones in what otherwise appears to be a Mesolithic context, there is a brief window visible in the record where the two worlds touched. Some archaeologists read this as a period of contact, possibly exchange, possibly tentative adoption of new animals or goods by existing Mesolithic communities before the full demographic transition took place. This kind of edge period, when old and new overlapped without either yet dominating, has been documented at other Neolithic transition sites across Europe. It tends to be brief. The outcome, wherever we can follow the genetic sequence, tends to be the same. By around 3800 BC, Farming communities were establishing themselves across Ireland. The pollen record, preserved in the anaerobic layers of Irish bogs, which record the types of pollen falling on water surfaces year by year across thousands of years, creating a continuous environmental archive of extraordinary resolution, shows this transition clearly. There are abrupt drops in tree pollen in the cores dated to this period, corresponding to rapid and large-scale forest clearance. Simultaneously, pollen from grasses and agricultural weeds, the species that colonize disturbed ground, that follow the plow and the grazing animal, spikes upward. The great forests that had covered the island since the glaciers retreated were being opened by polished stone axes, cleared by fire, and planted with crops for the first time in the island's history. Communities were settling along fertile river valleys, on the better limestone soils of the west, on the basalt plateaus of the northeast. The dead were being deposited in stone-built collective monuments. The court tombs and portal tombs and passage tombs that are scattered across the Irish landscape in their hundreds, that dot the Irish countryside from Donegal to Clare, that appear on every Ordnance Survey map of the island as small black triangles indicating a prehistoric structure of unknown exact purpose. These monuments were not simply graves, they were architectural statements, built from stone that would last for millennia, placed in the most prominent positions in the landscape, oriented with care towards specific astronomical events. They announced, "This land is ours. Our ancestors are here. We have made something permanent. We are a people who mark our dead in ways that will outlast the marking." The Mesolithic way of life had simply ceased. The salmon traps and the microlithic flint kits and the skin boats and the forest camps were gone. The language spoken at Mountsandel was gone. The names given to the river Bann and the Sperrin Mountains and the salmon pools and the hazel groves over 4,000 years of living with them. Those names were gone too, replaced by names in a language we also cannot hear, but which we know was not Celtic and was probably not Indo-European at all. Something older, something that had come west from the farming communities of the ancient Mediterranean, or developed along the Atlantic coast in the long generations between Anatolia and Ireland, and which was the language of these Neolithic people who left us no words we can recognize. The Mesolithic people were not exterminated in any dramatic sudden sense. 20% of the Neolithic gene pool traces back to them, but 20% is a residue. It is what survives when the dominant force overwhelms the older one, not by annihilation, but by sheer numerical weight, by the slow arithmetic of reproduction across enough generations. The only persistent trace of the Mesolithic world in what came after it is the trace left in the landscape itself. The Neolithic farmers who displaced the Mesolithic population chose many of the same locations, the same river valleys, the same fertile ridges, the same high places that catch the sky and offer views in multiple directions. The new people learned the land partly from the land, and partly, perhaps, from the fragmentary knowledge of the older inhabitants who survived the transition as a minority presence within the new population. 4,000 years of accumulated ecological knowledge does not vanish entirely when the people who held it are reduced to a genetic residue. Some of it transfers, some of it was written into the landscape itself, in the routes between productive sites, the crossing points of rivers, the seasonal rhythms of a particular geography. But the world of the first people was buried, and what replaced it was something that nobody, looking at the Mesolithic evidence alone, could have anticipated. The Neolithic people who settled Ireland between 4,000 and 2,500 BC were not simply farmers with an interest in large stones. They were, by any reasonable definition of the word, a civilization without writing, without cities in the urban sense, without metal tools, but a civilization in the sense that matters more, a society with a shared symbolic system, a sophisticated understanding of astronomy and mathematics, an engineering capability sufficient to reshape the physical landscape on a monumental scale, a social organization capable of coordinating the labor of hundreds or thousands of people across years or decades, and what appears to have been a connected island-wide network of communities sharing practices, maintaining kinship connections across great distances, and building according to a common set of principles that expressed a shared cosmological understanding. The oldest of these sites is Carrowmore, on the Cuil-era Peninsula west of Sligo town, where Knocknarea mountain rises above a flat limestone plain and the Atlantic shows silver on the western horizon. The monuments at Carrowmore are different in character from the great passage tombs of the Boyne Valley. They are quieter, rougher-edged, older feeling in the way that the earliest attempts at something tend to feel. Boulder circles of large glacial erratics surrounding central dolmens, many of them without the enclosed passages and corbelled roofs that would later characterize the most elaborate Irish passage tombs. Excavations by Swedish archaeologists in the late 1970s produced radiocarbon dates suggesting that some Carrowmore monuments may date to as early as 4600 BC, making them more than 1,000 years older than Newgrange and significantly older than any comparable megalithic construction currently known in Britain. Something like 65 monuments may once have occupied this peninsula. 30 survive in varying states of completeness. The rest were destroyed during the 19th century by quarrying operations and agricultural clearance, a loss whose full scale is difficult to absorb. What was once one of the most significant ceremonial landscapes in Atlantic Europe was reduced within the space of a few decades of Victorian-era land use to a representative remnant. The fragments that survive are still extraordinary, but to stand at Carrowmore and look at what remains requires also imagining what is not there, the 2/3 of a great ceremonial complex lost to the commercial and agricultural pressures of the 19th century. At the summit of Knocknarea above Carrowmore sits Queen Maeve's cairn, an enormous unexcavated mound that dominates the landscape for miles in every direction. The cairn is roughly 55 meters in diameter and 10 meters in height. It has never been archaeologically opened in any systematic sense. No professional excavation has been conducted within it. What it contains, whether a central passage, cremated remains, carved stones, astronomical alignments, is unknown. It is one of the largest unexcavated Neolithic monuments in Ireland, and it sits above the oldest megalithic cemetery in Ireland as a question that has not yet been asked in physical terms. Moving east and south from Sligo, another major Neolithic cemetery occupies the Brickleave Mountains at Carrowkeel, a series of passage tombs on exposed hilltops with views extending across much of Connaught on clear days. The Carrowkeel tombs are in many ways the least visited of Ireland's major Neolithic sites. They require a walk uphill through open moorland, and they receive only a fraction of the tourist attention given to the Boyne Valley monuments. But the views from these hilltops are extraordinary, and the cairns themselves, rough stone passages leading to corbelled chambers of considerable technical sophistication, speak to the same building tradition that would, in the same general period or slightly later, produce the great monuments of County Meath. The entrances to several Carrowkeel chambers are oriented to the midsummer sunset, creating a light display at the opposite end of the solar year from Newgrange. These were not random orientations. The builders understood the solar calendar well enough to place their monuments at both poles of the year. Loughcrew in County Meath sits on a series of hilltops southeast of Kells and contains a cemetery of approximately 30 monuments distributed across 3 main hills. The main mound, Cairn T, is oriented to the rising sun at the spring and autumn equinoxes. At dawn on those mornings, light enters the passage and travels to illuminate the carved backstone of the chamber. Radial solar motifs and geometric patterns carved with considerable precision in a display that continues, as designed, 5,000 years after its builders set the passage alignment to within a fraction of a degree of the equinox sunrise. 3 different solar holidays, 3 different monument complexes, each calibrated to a different moment in the astronomical year. And then there is the Boyne Valley, the complex known as Brúna Boine, the Palace of the Boyne, occupies a peninsula of high, fertile land in County Meath, enclosed by a pronounced bend in the River Boyne, approximately 40 miles north of Dublin. It contains 3 major passage tombs, Newgrange, Knowth and Dowth, along with dozens of smaller satellite tombs, stand-in stones, enclosures, and earthworks that together constitute the largest and most sophisticated concentration of Neolithic monument building in Ireland, and one of the most remarkable prehistoric complexes in Europe. Newgrange was built around 3200 BC. This figure is worth dwelling on at length. It predates the main construction phase of Stonehenge by 500 years. It predates the oldest pyramid in Egypt, the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, built around 2650 BC, by roughly 5.5 centuries. When the pharaohs of Egypt were working out how to build impermanent stone for the first time, Newgrange had already been standing for more than 500 years. The civilization that built it was not younger than Egyptian civilization or Mesopotamian civilization. In terms of monumental construction, it was older. The mound covers more than an acre of ground. The retaining curb consists of 97 large decorated stones, with the great entrance curbstone at the front, covered in triple spirals and lozenges that remain, after all this time, among the most striking pieces of abstract carving produced by any prehistoric culture anywhere in the world. The white quartz facade, reconstructed in the 1970s by the archaeologist Michael O'Kelly in a reconstruction that has attracted both celebration and criticism in the decades since, gives the monument a luminous quality on sunny days that was probably deliberate. Quartz is not local to the Boyne Valley, and its collection and transport from the Wicklow Mountains to the south were intentional choices that added significantly to the labor cost of the monument. The passage inside runs for 18 meters and leads to a cruciform chamber with a corbelled roof, a technique in which overlapping stone courses gradually close inward until a final capstone seals the vault that remains waterproof after 52 centuries. No mortar, no maintenance, just the careful interlocking of shaped stones following a geometric logic that its builders understood and that modern civil engineers still regard with genuine respect. At the winter solstice, for approximately 17 minutes around sunrise, a beam of light enters through a purpose-built roof box positioned above the entrance, a slit in the stone architecture placed with a precision that required either advanced mathematical knowledge of solar geometry or prolonged systematic observation of the sun's movement at this specific location across multiple years. The beam travels the full length of the 18-meter passage and illuminates the floor of the inner chamber. In the darkness of midwinter, in a space built from the bones of the dead, the sun arrives. The dead are lit from within. The precision of this alignment is not an accident and cannot be explained as coincidence. The roof box is a specific architectural feature with no structural function. It is not part of the roof of the monument. It is not required for the integrity of the corbelled chamber. It exists only to admit light at one specific angle at one specific time of year. Its creation required the builders to know, with considerable exactness, where the sun would rise on the shortest day of the year and at what angle its light would need to travel to reach the back of an 18-meter passage. That knowledge had to precede the construction of the monument itself, because the alignment of the passage had to be established before the surrounding mound was built over it. You cannot correct the orientation of a passage once the mound is in place. Knowth, the largest of the three main Brúna Bóinne mounds in terms of overall volume, contains the single largest collection of megalithic art known from any prehistoric site in Europe. Of approximately 900 decorated stones recorded from passage tomb contexts across all of Atlantic Europe, roughly 400 come from the Brúna Bóinne complex alone, and the majority of those are at Knowth. 90 of the mound's 127 curbstones are carved. The passages and chambers within contain further decorated orthostats and structural stones. Some of the carvings were placed on the backs of stones, in positions that would have been permanently hidden once the monument was completed. This hidden art, carved where no human eye would ever see it after construction was finished, raises questions about purpose and intended audience that no proposed explanation has satisfactorily resolved. One particular Knowth stone has been identified by researchers as containing what appears to be the oldest known representation of the moon in any prehistoric art tradition anywhere on Earth. A series of marks and crescents that, when interpreted as a systematic lunar calendar, indicate a community tracking the moon's cycle across extended periods with considerable care. The interpretation is contested, as many interpretations of megalithic art necessarily are, but the density and consistency of the astronomical content at Knowth across multiple stones, the solar and lunar symbols, the counting marks, the systematic recurrence of patterns at specific intervals around the mound's circumference, is too pervasive to be dismissed as coincidence or decoration. These people knew the sky. They had been watching it for long enough to understand the patterns, to predict the solstices and equinoxes with the confidence required to orient monuments to them, to track the lunar cycle across months and years. That knowledge was not written down in any form that has survived. It lived in the practice of observation, in the oral traditions that accompanied it, in the monuments themselves as physical instruments calibrated to celestial events. It required generations of careful watching to acquire. It required someone to remember what their grandparents had observed and to teach it to children who would remember it after them. And when the people who held that knowledge were gone, it went with them. In June 2020, a team of researchers led by geneticist Lara Cassidy of Trinity College Dublin, working in collaboration with colleagues from Queen's University Belfast, University College London, NUI Galway, University College Cork, the University of Cambridge, and the National Monument Service, published a paper in the journal Nature that changed what we knew about the society that built these monuments. The study had sequenced the whole genomes of 44 ancient Irish individuals drawn from sites across the Neolithic and Bronze Age record. Most of these individuals came from passage tomb contexts, the collective burials in which the tomb builders deposited their dead, typically in the form of cremated bone mixed with unburnt fragments, often commingled across generations in ways that suggest the bones were manipulated, moved, and rearranged as part of ongoing ritual activity. The deposits at Irish Passage tombs do not look like simple graves in the way we might intuit the term. They look more like places where the dead were worked with over time, visited, rearranged, added to, as part of an ongoing relationship between the living community and its accumulated ancestors. But one individual from the study was different. Catalogued as NG10, his bones have been found in the innermost chamber of Newgrange itself, in the most elaborately decorated recess of the monument, the right-hand alcove of the cruciform chamber, farthest from the entrance, the precise point to which the winter solstice light travels when it reaches its maximum penetration of the passage. His remains were unburnt, not cremated like most passage tomb deposits, but placed there whole, and his DNA told a story that the researchers were not expecting. NG10 had been born of a first-degree incestuous union, a pairing between a parent and child, or between two full siblings. The genetic signature of this relationship is unmistakable in the DNA data. It produces characteristic long runs of homozygosity, stretches of the genome where both inherited copies of a chromosome are identical, that are generated by no mechanism other than close-kin mating of this exact degree. There is no ambiguity in the signal. Someone in Neolithic Ireland 5,000 years ago was the child of a parent and their own offspring, or of two full siblings. Across human cultures and across recorded history, mating of this kind is subject to one of the most near-universal taboos in the anthropological record. The exceptions are historically documented almost exclusively in one specific social context: hereditary ruling dynasties operating under a theology of divine kingship. The idea that the ruler is not a political leader in any ordinary sense, but a sacred being whose bloodline must remain separate from that of common people, and for whom the ordinary rules of social conduct do not apply because they exist in a different category of being: ancient Egypt, the Inca Empire. A small number of other documented cases share this pattern. The 2020 paper suggested that this combination, incestuous origins plus placement in the innermost, most sacred chamber of the island's most important monument, at the precise point reached by the solstice light, was consistent with the existence of a ruling dynastic elite among the Irish Neolithic passage tomb builders. A class of individuals whose special status was marked in life by the exceptional nature of their bloodline, and in death by their placement at the sacred center of the most significant monument in the landscape. The study went further. The same individual appeared to share genetic segments with people buried at passage tombs in County Sligo, at Carrowmore and Carrowkeel, more than 150 kilometers away. And those Sligo individuals were themselves related to a person buried at the Millen Bay Monument in County Down. The same extended kinship network, it seemed, had members deposited in major tomb complexes at three separate ends of the island, from the Atlantic coast of Connaught to the northeast coast of Ulster to the Boyne Valley in between. A triangle of kinship spanning the full length of Ireland, maintained across generations, apparently holding a privileged relationship to the monuments that organized the sacred geography of Neolithic Irish society. It is important to note that this interpretation has been challenged by subsequent research. A study published in late 2025 by a team including researchers from the University of York argued that the evidence for a ruling elite at Newgrange is significantly less clear-cut than the 2020 paper proposed. The counter-argument holds that the incestuous origins of NG10 may represent an isolated anomaly rather than a dynastic norm, that the individual's placement in the chamber does not necessarily indicate that his contemporaries were aware of his incestuous origins, and that the broader Neolithic Irish burial record, with its emphasis on collective deposition, mixed cremated remains, and apparently communal use of tomb spaces, is more consistent with a relatively egalitarian society than with a divine kingship model. The 2025 study's authors noted that as NG10's bones were found mixed among other remains, and as the monument was built in stages and used across centuries, there is no certainty that NG10 was placed in the chamber as a specially honored individual during his lifetime community's active use of the site. The debate remains open, and the evidence genuinely supports both readings. Serious archaeology proceeds through exactly this kind of productive disagreement, and both positions deserve to be held in mind simultaneously as informed uncertainty. What is not in dispute is the physical scale of what these communities achieved. Moving the materials for Newgrange alone required transporting multiple multi-ton stones from sources tens of kilometers away, including the curbstones from Wicklow Greywacca quarries, roughly 80 kilometers south of the site. The Great Entrance curbstone, approximately 5 tons of decorated stone, was brought from those quarries and placed precisely at the entrance before the surrounding mound was built around it. The quartz that once faced the monument came from the same general region, transported in quantities that would have required sustained, organized effort over a considerable period. None of this was accomplished with wheels. None of it was accomplished with metal. The people who built Newgrange and Knowth and Dowth did so with stone tools, wooden sledges, ropes, rollers, levers, human muscle, and a depth of engineering knowledge that expressed itself most clearly in the precision of the solstice alignment, the watertight, corbelled roof, and the careful coursing of the decorated curbstones around the mound's perimeter. At Paulnabrone in the Burren of County Clare, excavated by archaeologist Anne Lynch in the 1980s, the record opens onto Neolithic life from a different angle. The portal tomb stands in the white limestone pavement of the Burren, a flat capstone balanced on 2 tall uprights, creating a chamber whose visual drama is amplified by the stark, karst landscape surrounding it. When the conservation excavation was carried out, the remains of at least 33 individuals were recovered from beneath the capstone, deposited across a period of roughly 600 years between approximately 3,800 and 3,200 BC. Paulnabrone is currently the oldest dated megalithic monument in Ireland. Among the Paulnabrone dead was a man who had been shot with a flint-tipped arrow. The arrowhead was still embedded in his hip bone, and the bone showed signs of having partially healed around it. He had survived the injury and lived with it for some period before his death. None of the adults buried at Paulnabrone were over the age of 40. Many showed the physical signatures of heavy labor in their skeletons, arthritic changes in the joints, heavily worn teeth, the marks of a life worked hard from a young age. One infant among the Paulnabrone dead carried a trisomy of chromosome 21, what we now call Down syndrome. This infant is the earliest confirmed case of Down syndrome in the archaeological record. The fact of this identification sits quietly in the scientific literature, making no demands on our interpretation. An infant born with this condition in a Neolithic farming community in County Clare 6,000 years ago was placed in the communal tomb with the same care as the adults around them. What the community understood about this infant's condition, what they felt toward them, what place they held in the life of the community before they died. None of that is available to us. What is available is the bone in the ground, placed deliberately in the dark, in the care of the ancestors. At Knowth, the carvings on the stones remain, after decades of specialist study, untranslated in any complete formal sense. Nearly half of all known megalithic art in Atlantic Europe is concentrated in this single monument, studied by researchers approaching it from every angle available: astronomical, anthropological, neurological, purely formal, and art historical. The theory that some motifs derive from visual patterns generated by altered states of consciousness, the entoptic hypothesis associated with researcher Jeremy Dronfield, proposes that the spirals and concentric circles are consistent with the internal visual experiences of people in certain meditative or trance states, and that the passage tomb tradition may have incorporated altered consciousness as part of its spiritual practice. This interpretation is contested but not disproven. What no researcher has managed to produce is a reading of the carved system as a system, an account of what the spirals mean, an explanation of why the lozenges recur in the specific distributions and frequencies they do, a decipherment of the hidden art carved on stone backs that would never be seen. The carvings are a text in a language we cannot read. They were made by people who knew what they meant. Those people are 4,000 years gone from any memory that can reach us. The text remains, the meaning waits. Around 2500 BC, the pattern changed. The passage tombs went silent. Construction ceased at the Great Boyne Valley monuments and at the passage tomb cemeteries of Sligo and Meath and Down. The tradition of collective, multi-generational bone deposits in corbelled chambers simply stopped. New types of monument appeared: circular earthwork enclosures without elaborate stone chambers, simpler burial mounds covered by earth rather than the massive cairns of the Neolithic, standing stones and stone circles of a kind distinct from passage tomb architecture. New types of pottery appeared, the characteristic bell-shaped vessels that have given the whole phenomenon its name, found from the Iberian Peninsula to Britain and Ireland in a distribution that suggests a rapidly spreading cultural package. New technologies arrived, metalworking beginning with copper and gold and extending quickly to bronze. New burial practices were adopted, individual interments with grave goods placed beside the body, in deliberate contrast to the collective, anonymous, multi-generational bone deposits of the passage tomb tradition. And the genetics changed, far more dramatically than the material culture shift alone could account for. The Bell Beaker phenomenon arrived in Britain and Ireland from the European continent, carried by people whose ancestry traces back, ultimately, to the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grassland zone north of the Black Sea, extending from modern Ukraine east into Central Asia. These people's ancestry is distinctive in the ancient DNA record, rich in what geneticists call Western steppe herder ancestry, a mixture of Eastern hunter-gatherer and ancient Near Eastern farmer components that had been combined on the Eurasian steppe over the preceding millennia. Their ancestors had been intensive pastoral herders, moving with large cattle and horse herds across a landscape defined by grass and sky rather than forest and field. They were, genetically, profoundly different from the Neolithic people they encountered when they moved west into Europe. The magnitude of the replacement that occurred in Britain and Ireland in the centuries around 2500 to 2000 BC is, when confronted directly, genuinely difficult to absorb. Ancient DNA studies of Bronze Age British populations indicate that within a few hundred years of the Beaker arrivals, approximately 90% of the Neolithic gene pool in Britain had been replaced by the incoming ancestry. The people who had built Stonehenge were, within the archaeological equivalent of a heartbeat, almost entirely replaced by a genetically distinct population. Their descendants constituted only about 10% of the population that immediately followed them. The same transition happened in Ireland. The ancient DNA evidence from Bronze Age Irish sites, including the Rathlin Island Bronze Age individuals, published in 2015 by the Trinity College Dublin team, and the larger dataset from the 2020 study, shows the Neolithic ancestry reduced to a minority component by the early Bronze Age, replaced by a population carrying high levels of steppe-derived ancestry. The professor who led the 2015 study, Dan Bradley, described the process as a great wave of genome change that swept into Europe from above the Black Sea, all the way to the shores of its most westerly island. The Bronze Age individuals from Rathlin Island carried the Y chromosome haplogroup R1b1a2a1a2c, a specific lineage within the R1b family that is now carried by approximately 65% of Irish men, and that dominates the male lineages of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany. This Y chromosome lineage is essentially absent in Neolithic populations. It arrived with the Beaker people. Within a few generations of their arrival, it had displaced almost all the Neolithic male lineages. The Rathlin individuals showed something else significant. They carried the blue-eye alleles, the lighter skin pigmentation variants, the physical profile we now associate with the Irish look, the fair and freckled complexion that the world thinks of as distinctively Irish. This profile did not come from the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who first inhabited the island. It did not come from the dark-complexioned Neolithic farmers who built the passage tombs. It came from the steppe. The characteristic Irish appearance is a Bronze Age import, carried to this island by the same wave of demographic replacement that overwrote the Neolithic civilization. The Rathlin individuals also carried the C282Y mutation associated with hereditary hemochromatosis, the iron overload condition that is so common in people of Irish descent that it is sometimes called informally the Celtic disease, though that label is genetically misleading. This mutation arrived with the Bronze Age steppe migrants. It has been present in Irish populations for approximately 4,000 years, and its current high frequency in Ireland is a direct consequence of the Bronze Age demographic bottleneck through which so much of the modern Irish gene pool passed. What caused the scale of this replacement? Several overlapping factors are plausibly implicated, none of them fully proven. The disease hypothesis has gained credibility with the discovery of ancient plague, DNA, Yersinia pestis, ancestral to the bacterium responsible for later bubonic plague, in Neolithic European populations from the period just before the Beaker expansion. If epidemic disease significantly weakened the Neolithic populations of Europe in the centuries around 2500 BC, the arriving Beaker groups would have had a demographic advantage that could help explain the speed and completeness of the replacement. The asymmetry in the genetic data is striking and requires some acknowledgement. The Y chromosome, inherited only through the male line, shows a near-complete replacement of Neolithic male lineages by Beaker lineages. The autosomal data, reflecting ancestry from both parents, shows a replacement of roughly 90%, but not quite total. The gap between these two figures suggests that female Neolithic ancestry persisted to a somewhat greater degree than male Neolithic ancestry. What social processes produced that asymmetry, whether violence, social dominance structures, differential disease mortality, or some combination, cannot be determined from genetics alone. The data describes an outcome without specifying the mechanism. What can be said is this: the civilization that built Newgrange and Knowth, and Carramore and Loughcrew, the people who counted the lunar cycles in stone, who oriented their monuments to the solstice and equinox sunrises with sub-degree precision, who maintained kinship networks across the full length of the island, who carved 400 stones with a visual language we cannot read. Those people were, within a few generations of the Beaker arrival, genetically marginalized to near invisibility in the population that followed them. The monuments remained. The Bronze Age communities who settled around the Boyne Valley clearly regarded the great mounds as significant places. There is evidence of continued activity at Knowth and Newgrange during the Bronze Age, of offerings deposited, of the landscape continuing to be used for ritual purposes. But the knowledge that had lived in the people, the understanding of what the alignments meant, how to read the carvings, what was supposed to happen, and in whose name, that knowledge went with the people who held it. The monuments became mysteries, ancient, powerful, clearly significant mysteries, but mysteries nonetheless. The Bronze Age communities who lived around them knew they were sacred. They could not have said why in any precise technical sense. The passage tombs were already more ancient to an early Bronze Age Irish community than the Norman invasions are to us today. The world that built them was as remote from them as the world of Charlemagne is from ours. Medieval Irish literature is full of stories about what happened before the Irish were Irish. The Lebor Gabála Érenn, the Book of the Taking of Ireland, commonly rendered as the Book of Invasions, is a medieval compilation assembled in its present form by Christian monks in around the 11th century CE, but drawing on oral traditions of considerably greater antiquity. It describes the successive peopling of Ireland through a series of mythological invasion narratives. First came Cessair, granddaughter of Noah, arriving before the biblical flood. Then the Partholonians, then the Nemedians, then the Firbolg, then the Tuatha Dé Danann, and finally the Milesians, the sons of Meath, who represent the ancestors of the historical Gaelic Irish. Each group arrives, establishes itself, encounters opposition, and is either destroyed, driven out, or displaced underground by the next wave. Modern scholarship treats the Lebor Gabála as a highly unreliable historical document in any literal sense. Its framework is Christian, the biblical flood, Noah's granddaughter as the first settler, an overlay imposed by monastic compilers who needed to reconcile Irish mythological tradition with Christian cosmological architecture. The dates are impossible. The genealogies are internally contradictory. Many of the individual narratives appear to be late inventions serving the political needs of medieval Irish dynasties, rather than preserved memories from genuinely ancient traditions. And yet, beneath the biblical scaffolding and the medieval elaboration, the structure of the Lebor Gabála, its fundamental concept of successive populations arriving in waves, each displacing or transforming the one before, with the oldest populations retreating into the earth or to supernatural otherworlds, maps with notable closeness onto the demographic history that the ancient DNA is now revealing. 3 distinct pre-Gaelic populations, each one displaced by the next, the oldest ones associated with the underground and the sea, the most recent pre-Gaelic group associated with magic, wisdom, and extraordinary monuments, all of it ending with a negotiated withdrawal into the sacred mounds. Look at the Fomorians first. The Fomorians are the oldest presences in the mythology, beings who are in Ireland before any of the invasion cycles begin, who appear in the stories as dark, chaotic forces associated with the undersea and the underground, with the primitive and the pre-agricultural. Their name is of uncertain etymology, but one plausible derivation connects it to words meaning the people from below the sea, or the undersea people. They are consistently depicted as other, not Celtic, not civilized in the way the later mythological peoples are civilized, resistant and persistent, and rooted in the deepest layer of the land. If you are looking for a mythological encoding of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, the dark-complexioned, first-arriving people who held this island for 4,000 years before the farmers came, who left no monuments and no writing, and were otherwise nearly invisible to any later tradition, the Fomorians are as close as mythology comes to that kind of figure. Not because anyone deliberately constructed a myth to preserve the memory of Mesolithic people, but because the memory of being displaced, of encountering something old and resistant in a land being settled for the first time, tends to produce exactly this kind of mythological residue, the people who were there first, who do not fit the new order, who remain at the margins as a dark and ambiguous force. Then look at the Tuatha Dé Danann. The Tuatha Dé Danann, whose name may mean the people of the goddess Danu, though the exact etymology has been debated by Celtic scholars for generations, are the mythological race who hold Ireland before the Milesians arrive and defeat them. They are depicted as beings of extraordinary wisdom, skill, and power, commanders of magic, masters of craftsmanship and warfare and healing. They come from the northern islands of the world, arriving in a cloud of mist. They build remarkable things and hold dominion over Ireland for a long, unspecified period. And when the Milesians arrive and defeat them in the final battle that resolves the mythological sequence, the Tuatha Dé Danann do not leave Ireland. They retreat underground. They go into the Sligo, the ancient mounds, the passage tombs of the Neolithic builders, and they continue to inhabit the island from beneath, in a parallel existence that is always present but usually invisible. Their world is still there, underneath the surface world. The boundary between the two is porous at certain times of year and in certain places. The Dagda, the great father god of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the deity associated with fertility, abundance, wisdom, and the earth itself, has his home at Newgrange. His son Angus Og, the god of love and youth, also resides there, eventually taking the monument from his father through a mythological sleight involving the tides of time. The passage tombs of the Boyne Valley, built by people whose civilization ended more than 2,000 years before the Celtic-speaking Milesians arrived in Ireland, are described in the mythology as the underground palaces of gods, too ancient and too powerful to be displaced from the land entirely. This is remarkable to sit with. The mythology does not claim that the passage tombs were built by the Gaelic Irish. It acknowledges, in the only framework available to it, that these structures belong to something older. The builders have become gods, the monuments have become homes. The erasure is acknowledged obliquely in the very architecture of the story. What was here before us was divine. We have inherited the monuments, but not the knowledge that made them. The Firbolg, the third major pre-Milesian population in the Lebor Gabála, present a different interpretive possibility. They are described as darker, more agricultural, associated with the working of the earth, the tilling of the soil, the fundamentals of farming life. Some researchers have tentatively suggested that the Fir Bolg may encode a memory of the Neolithic farming population, the dark-complexioned, Near Eastern ancestry farmers who built the passage tombs and were subsequently displaced by the steppe ancestry Beaker people. The ancient DNA published for the Neolithic Ballinahatti woman showed a physical profile consistent with darker skin and hair than the Bronze Age and Iron Age populations that followed, exactly the kind of visual difference that, filtered through millennia of oral transmission, could produce a mythological population distinguished from the later inhabitants by their appearance and their association with the fundamental work of the land. There is a tradition preserved in various forms across the Irish mythological material which describes the terms under which the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Milesians divided the island after the final battle. The Milesians would hold the surface of Ireland, the visible land, the agricultural landscape, the political world. The Tuatha Dé Danann would hold the underground, the Sidhe, the mounds, the deep places where the old powers resided. The land would continue to be known by the names of the three territorial goddesses, Eriu, Banba, and Fodla. This is a story about cultural accommodation. A new population, arriving in Ireland to find a landscape full of extraordinary monuments they did not build and could not fully explain, incorporated those structures into their own mythology by making them the homes of older gods. The passage tombs that the Beaker people and their cultural descendants had lived beside for 1,000 years without understanding became the palaces of the Tuatha Dé Danann. The people who built them became divine. Their achievements were preserved in a manner of speaking by being attributed to beings who were more than human. The ancient DNA and the mythology are, in this respect, pointing in the same direction. Something extraordinary was here before the Irish. It retreated underground. The monuments it left behind are still standing. One of the things that disappears from popular accounts of Irish prehistoric monuments is the sheer scale of what has not yet been excavated, mapped, or even located. Dowth, the third of the three main Bruna Boina passage tombs, has never been the subject of a full modern excavation. It is the largest of the three by overall diameter, approximately 85 meters across, somewhat larger than Newgrange. Its interior was partially investigated in the 19th century by a group that included amateur antiquarians and landowners whose methods bear no resemblance to what archaeological practice now requires. They dug into the mound from above, broke through corbelled chambers, removed material without systematic recording, and left behind a disturbed interior whose gaps cannot be recovered. What they found was fragmentary. What they destroyed in finding it is irretrievable. The mound today sits at the eastern end of the Boyne Valley complex, visible from the road, accessible only by walking across a field, closed to guided tours in the way that Newgrange and Knowth are not. It is the Boyne Valley Monument that the heritage infrastructure has not fully reached. In its largely undisturbed state, it preserves not just archaeological remains but archaeological potential. The possibility that a proper modern excavation would reveal solar or lunar alignments, art, or burial sequences that would dramatically extend and complicate the picture the 2020 Trinity College study built. Dowth has 2 known passages and chambers that have not been fully recorded in modern archaeological terms. What else it contains, if anything, is unknown. Queen Maeve's cairn on Knocknarea in County Sligo is in the same condition of known but unopened potential. At roughly 55 meters in diameter and 10 meters in height, it is one of the largest cairns in Ireland. It sits above the Carramore megalithic cemetery, itself the oldest in Ireland, in a position of commanding visibility. Visible from Carramore below, from Carrowkeel in the mountains, to the southeast, from the Atlantic to the west, and from most of the surrounding landscape for many miles in every direction. This placement suggests it was intended to be seen from far away, to serve as a landmark and a reference point for a ceremonial landscape that organized the whole peninsula. No professional archaeological excavation has been conducted within it. What it contains could be the most elaborate passage tomb in Connaught, with chambers and decorated stones and astronomical alignments that would reshape our understanding of the Western Irish Neolithic tradition. The question has simply not yet been asked in physical terms, and the cairn sits above the oldest cemetery in Ireland, containing whatever it contains, having outlasted every political arrangement and every cultural transformation that has occurred on this island since it was built. The geophysical surveys of recent years have been revealing what lies beneath the surface in ways that excavation alone cannot match. At Navan Fort in County Armagh, Emain Macha, in the Irish mythological tradition, described as the seat of the kings of Ulster and the setting of the Ulster cycle myths, a 2018 survey using magnetic susceptibility measurement and electrical resistivity tomography found remnants of subterranean structures extending beyond the visible earthwork boundaries. The study, published in the Oxford Journal of Archaeology, concluded that the site's ritual footprint had been significantly underestimated based on above-ground features alone. The buried structures included what appeared to be remnants of earlier enclosures and alignments partially obliterated by the later earthwork construction. Navan Fort is an Iron Age site, not a Neolithic one, but the principle its geophysical survey demonstrates applies across the whole span of Irish prehistoric archaeology. Sites that appear straightforward from the surface routinely contain, when investigated non-invasively, evidence of earlier phases of activity that stretch back far beyond the visible construction. Ireland has been continuously inhabited for 10,000 years, and the ground beneath any significant site tends to be layered with evidence of multiple periods of human use, each one built on and partially obscuring the one before. LIDAR surveying, airborne laser scanning that strips away vegetation and modern ground features to reveal the underlying topography with extraordinary precision, has added hundreds of previously unknown sites to the Irish archaeological record since the technology became widely available. The LIDAR survey of the Hill of Tara and its surrounding landscape revealed an extensive complex extending well beyond the known archaeological boundaries, linear earthworks, enclosures, and possible monument traces that had been invisible at ground level under centuries of agricultural use. The survey suggested that Tara was not an isolated hilltop monument, but the center of a ritual landscape covering many square kilometers. Similar surveys of the broader Boyne Valley landscape produced comparable results: new monument features, new linear earthworks, traces of enclosures, and processional routes not previously recorded. The Boyne Valley complex, already the most intensively studied prehistoric landscape in Ireland, turned out to be more extensive and more complex than decades of ground-level survey had established. Irish bogs deserve particular attention in any accounting of what remains under the ground. The anaerobic, acidic environment of a raised bog preserves organic material with a thoroughness that no other natural deposit in the Irish landscape matches. Bog bodies, human remains, sometimes with skin and hair and internal organs preserved, sometimes with their last meals still identifiable, have been recovered from Irish bogs at intervals across the past century. Tollen Man in Denmark, Cloneycavan Man, and Old Croggan Man in Ireland, each one a person, not a type, carrying in the chemistry of their preserved bodies information about diet, health, cause of death, and the ritual circumstances of their deposition that no other evidence source can provide. Beyond bodies, Irish bogs have preserved wooden objects of remarkable quality. Bronze Age wooden trackways, built to allow movement across boggy ground, preserved wheel sections, wooden vessels, and, perhaps most significant for understanding the prehistoric sacred landscape, ritual deposits. Hoards of bronze weapons placed in bogs during the Bronze Age and Iron Age represent what appear to be votive offerings, gifts made to the water and the dark, to whatever powers were understood to inhabit the boundary between the surface world and the underground. The sheer quantity and quality of Bronze Age metalwork recovered from Irish bogs suggests that the bog was understood as a sacred threshold, a place where offerings to the gods of the underworld could be made. Over 1,000 souterrains are recorded across Ireland, the underground stone-built chambers and passages associated primarily with early medieval ring forts. Their primary functions were practical: food storage at cool, consistent temperatures, hiding places and escape routes during Viking raids and other conflicts. But the ground beneath an early medieval site in Ireland is almost invariably older than the medieval structure built on it. Ring forts were frequently constructed on or near Neolithic and Bronze Age sites, sometimes because those sites retained ceremonial significance into later periods, sometimes simply because the same natural features, elevated ground, good drainage, access to water, made a location attractive across multiple periods of occupation. The picture that emerges from all of this is of an island whose above-ground archaeological record, already extraordinary by European standards, represents only a fraction of what the ground itself preserves. The passage tombs that are known, mapped, and dated are the ones that survived agricultural clearance, quarrying, road building, and the simple attrition of centuries of land use. The ones that did not survive those pressures are invisible above ground, present only as crop marks in dry summers, as anomalies in geophysical surveys, as traces in pollen cores. In the lowland areas of Ireland, where the Neolithic and Bronze Age populations were often densest, the destruction of surface visible monuments through centuries of intensive cultivation approaches totality in some regions. What appears from the surface as ordinary farmland reveals itself, when surveyed from the air or with the appropriate instruments, as a palimpsest of circular and rectangular shapes, each one a former structure, most of them never recorded. Every one of those shapes was once a place where people gathered or buried their dead or made offerings to whatever powers they understood as governing the world. They are gone from the visible record. They are not gone from the ground. The ground beneath Ireland is a library, a very old one, and very large, and mostly unread. There is a question worth sitting with as we approach the close of this. When we say that a civilization was erased, genetically replaced, culturally overwritten, linguistically silenced, what exactly do we mean? What does it mean for a world to be buried deliberately, and what, ultimately, survives the burial? The Mesolithic inhabitants of Ireland are, in any simple genetic sense, nearly gone from the modern Irish population. The small percentage of their ancestry that survived the Neolithic demographic transition has been diluted across 5,000 years of subsequent mixing to the point of near invisibility in any individual genome. The Neolithic farmers who replaced them so thoroughly are themselves largely gone, replaced in turn by the Bronze Age Beaker arrivals to a degree that makes the first replacement look gradual by comparison. Even the Bronze Age Beaker gene pool, so dramatically dominant after 2500 BC, was subsequently modified by Iron Age population movements, by Viking settlement patterns, by the later demographic pressures of a continuously occupied, continuously inhabited island. Every period added something, every generation adjusted the proportions, and yet something persists. Modern Irish populations carry, in proportions that vary by region and family lineage, the genetic residues of all these layers. The fine-scale genetic structure of modern Irish populations reflects, in patterns that researchers have been able to map with increasing precision, the geography of ancient settlement and successive replacement. The southeast of Ireland, which had sustained Bronze Age and Iron Age contact with Britain and continental Europe, tends to show higher proportions of early European farmer ancestry, the Neolithic component, than the northwest. The northwest, more isolated and less penetrated by later immigration, shows different patterns that may reflect older distributions. The Y chromosome haplogroup R1b-L21, arriving with the Beaker people and present in roughly 65% of Irish men today, has subclades whose distributions across the island reflect the geography of Bronze Age settlement and subsequent demographic concentration across several millennia. None of this is an argument for any particular ethnic identity or genealogical purity. The human biology of this island carries the complete physical record of everyone who ever lived here, in whatever proportions the arithmetic of reproduction across 250 generations has produced. The first dark-complexioned people who crossed the water to Mountsandel, the Near Eastern ancestry farmers who built Pulnabrone, the woman buried at Ballinahatti, whose genome was the first Neolithic Irish genome ever sequenced, the person at the heart of Newgrange, whose incestuous origins encode a mystery about power and divinity that archaeology has not yet fully resolved. The Beaker arrivals with their R1b chromosomes and their steppe-derived metabolism and their bell-shaped pottery, all of them contributed something to what came after. None of them left nothing. The landscape carries something too, and this may be the most permanent form of the inheritance. The River Boyne still runs in the same channel it ran when the Neolithic builders chose this peninsula for their monuments. The same winter solstice sunrise that illuminates the chamber at Newgrange today illuminated it when the last stone of the roof box was placed into position, and has illuminated it every clear winter solstice since, for 52 centuries, regardless of who held the land above it, what language was spoken in the fields outside, what gods were prayed to in the surrounding settlements. The Burren's white limestone is still worked by rain into the same karst formations that Neolithic farmers grazed their cattle on. The mountains above Carrowmore still catch the Atlantic light in the afternoon and cast the same long shadows across the same landscape they have cast since the glaciers left. The monuments are still there. This is what makes the idea of deliberate burial worth examining with care. You can bury the people, you can replace the genes, you can overwrite the language, the oral history, the mythology, the social memory. All of those things are portable and vulnerable to the pressure of demographic replacement. A language disappears when the last person who speaks it dies, and the children who will never learn it grow up speaking something else. An oral tradition disappears when the conditions that sustained it, the community, the ritual calendar, the practitioners who knew which parts required performance in which sacred place, are disrupted beyond recovery. These things are soft in the physical sense. They leave no impression in the soil. But you cannot bury 150,000 tons of stone. You cannot bury an astronomical alignment precise to less than a degree of arc. You cannot bury the 90 decorated curbstones of Knowth, still standing in their positions, still facing outward in their carved language, still carrying on the backs of several stones, the hidden art that was meant only for the monument and the forces within it. The monuments were not buried deliberately. They were too large and too visibly significant to ignore, and so they remained, becoming in sequence the Sida, the fairy mounds, the ancient ruins debated by 18th century antiquarians, the subject of systematic archaeological excavation, the UNESCO World Heritage Site, with guided tours and a lottery for solstice morning attendance. At each stage of this long journey, some trace of what these structures originally were accompanied them, not intact, not legible, but present. The way a watermark persists in paper long after the object that created it is gone. The way a tune survives being played in a different key, in a different mode, by people who no longer know its original words. Something was carried through from the world that made these things, into the world that inherited them without understanding them, and into the world that is only now beginning to read what they say. The work of that reading is happening now, with tools that the builders could not have imagined. Mass spectrometers extracting ancient DNA from the molecular fragments preserved in 5,000-year-old teeth. Airborne LiDAR revealing the outlines of monuments that ploughing has long since erased from the surface. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetic gradiometry mapping structures beneath fields that have been cultivated for centuries without anyone knowing what lies a meter below the plough soil. Isotope analysis of human bones determining where a person grew up, what they ate, whether they spent their childhood in one landscape and their death in another. The ancient DNA extracted from a Neolithic tooth in a laboratory in Dublin is not a connection to the dead in any mystical sense. It is something more modest and more remarkable, a material record, a physical continuity, a thread of molecular information that was laid down in a hilltop tomb in County Sligo or a dolmen in the Burren thousands of years ago, and has been waiting in the dark and the slow chemistry of preservation ever since. It does not speak to us. It does not know it is being read, but read it is, and what it says is changing the story we tell about this island in ways that will take generations to fully absorb. What that record is telling us, slowly, partially, with the appropriate uncertainties that serious science always acknowledges, is that the world underneath what we call Irish history is more complex, more deep, more densely populated with distinct and accomplished peoples than any standard account of the island has previously managed to convey. Ireland was not born Celtic. The Celtic-speaking world is the most recent of several distinct civilizations that have occupied this landscape. The one before it built monuments that still shape the horizon over the Boyne Valley. The one before that built Carrowmore and tended the dead on the exposed hilltops of Sligo. The one before that left its bones and its tools in the soil beside the River Bann and was largely absorbed into the world that followed it without leaving a name or a word or a structure behind. The passage tombs were built as houses of the dead, yes, but they were also built as a kind of message, a statement pressed into stone in the most permanent way available to people without metal tools. We were here, and we knew how the sky moved, and we oriented our buildings to prove it, and we built them to last beyond any single generation or dynasty or language. The solstice light does not know or care who holds the land above the mound. It enters the passage on the same morning every year, regardless of what has changed in the world outside. It has been doing this since before Egypt built its first pyramid. It will continue doing it after every living language in use today has changed beyond recognition. The builders understood impermanence. They had buried enough of their own dead in these chambers, across generation upon generation, to understand that individuals pass and communities pass, and the things made by human hands outlast the humans who made them. They built accordingly, not for their own time, but for the longest time they could imagine, which has turned out to be longer than they might have hoped, and shorter than the structures themselves have lasted. We are standing in the aftermath of that understanding. The mounds are on the hill. The light still enters on the shortest day. The carved stones are still in their positions at Knowth, recording in a visual language we cannot read whatever it was. These people understood about the movement of the sky and the nature of death and the relationship between the two. There is more still to find. Dowth has not been fully excavated. Queen Maeve's cairn has never been opened. The geophysics of the Boyne Valley landscape keeps revealing new features. The Knoth carvings are not translated. The DNA analysis of Irish prehistoric populations is still in relatively early stages compared with what will eventually be possible. The next discovery may come from a laboratory extracting DNA from a tooth found decades ago in a museum storage collection. It may come from a LiDAR survey of a landscape that has not yet been flown. It may come from a farmer noticing that the ground sounds different when you walk across a particular field after rain. The ground beneath this island is full of other people's stories. We are only beginning, slowly and carefully and with appropriate humility, to hear them. If the kind of unhurried journey through buried time that we have followed tonight is the kind of thing that helps you find your way towards sleep, there are more stories here of the same slow and careful kind. In the mounds we have not visited, in the unexcavated cairns above the Atlantic, in the continuing work of laboratories and field archaeologists quietly recovering what the ground has kept. If you find yourself moved to leave a thought in the comments, where you are listening from, what part of this history stayed with you, what questions it opened that remain unanswered, that is genuinely welcome. For now, the mounds are dark. The Boyne is running south of the Great Mound in the direction it has always run. The curbstones at Knoth stand in their positions around the perimeter, carved with marks that meant something to someone in a language that has been silent for 4,000 years, and that might, one quiet morning in a laboratory somewhere, begin to speak again. Let the questions rest where the monuments rest, slowly, in the dark, and for a very long time. Good night.